Aloha everyone, it's Ajanette, and we are going to come back and finish up the Chapter 8 lecture on sexual response or arousal. So again, we focused on attraction, Chapter 7, looking at some psychological factors that might draw us to a prospective romantic partner, including their appearance, their social status, proximity, just general exposure to them, some personality traits, and what constitutes an attractive person. And now we're going to focus on sexual response, which is referencing the arousal, the physiological response that we have when we're drawn to someone. This taps into the sensuality element of human sexuality. So at the beginning of our course together, we talked about different elements that interconnect and shape our overall sense of human sexuality and our overall experience of human sexuality. So it's not only just our anatomical structures and our reproductive abilities, but also our sense of intimacy and connection. Our human sexuality involves our own identities, our own body image, and then it also involves the boundaries and consent. Sadly, that also means that there's a risk of coercion and assault, which we will talk about. And all of that kind of at the core is grounded in our values, our culture, our religion. And when we're talking about this as well, sensuality comes into play in that, our bodily senses. When we're talking about sensuality, right, we're talking about our sensory experiences. And touch is a critical element of that sexual experience. And so sensuality is a key component of our sexuality, our sexual experience, our sexual enjoyment. And it can be a critical component of those arousal responses as well. So sensuality and that touch, that sensation that comes from being touched and how you're touched and where you're touched can actually trigger physiological responses. Also that tap into that autonomic nervous system, right? So being aroused can not only increase your attraction and cause you to release certain hormones, but being touched in certain ways can trigger that arousal. And what happens when you do activate that autonomic nervous system is your bodily chemistry changes. So your brain chemistry changes, you start to release different neurotransmitters, including the oxytocin that was discussed in Chapter 7. But also, you can have stress hormones that are released, in negative ways or positive ways. And you also have your heart rate that's elevated, your respiration rate that's elevated, your pupils are dilated. You actually can start to sweat a little bit, and you might sweat in different areas of your body, not just, your hands might become clammy, but other parts of your body. You can actually feel kind of a tingly sensation, maybe even get some goosebumps when you're touched, and specifically in different erogenous zones, and we'll go over some of those areas. And the pheromone responses, both your pheromone production might increase, and you might become more sensitive to the pheromones of those around you as well. So you definitely can become more aware of those things. We typically we're not alerted to pheromones just when we walk past someone, but when we're aroused, then our pheromone sensitivity and production increases as well. So that sexual response, what we're talking about is that arousal, that physiological response. Now, there's definitely biological elements, but there's definitely sociological elements. We are socialized to respond in certain ways and to certain stimuli, right? And in different cultures, different things are deemed attractive. In some cultures, breasts are exposed, and so they're not they're not a regular part of attraction, they may not be as arousing as you might see in American society, where we do tend to be drawn to breasts, particularly in a woman, right? Know that every person has our own biochemistry, our own biological processes. So how our body responds to arousal, sexual or otherwise, is going to be different than someone else and how they respond. And so part of a really good, healthy, empowered sense of sexuality is knowing your body, knowing how you respond, knowing the types of touch that trigger that sexual arousal and that response, and then being able to communicate those effectively. And this is where masturbation comes into play, because you can touch yourself in different ways, in different areas with different pressure, and all of that helps you to understand how your body is responding to that touch and what is arousing and what isn't. And the more you can become aware of your own responses and your own bodily enjoyment, the more you can communicate that with your partners. And also know that arousal can be influenced by your own personal experiences. They can also change over time. I want you to be mindful that a trauma can impact how your body responds, whether it's a physical trauma, such as being abused or assaulted, or whether it's a psychological trauma, such as being shamed or condemned. Those things definitely can impact the psychological elements that can either dampen a response or heighten a response. And so we want to be mindful of that interaction and how our experiences in the world can both positively and negatively shape how our body responds to sexual arousal. And then also what we find to be sexually stimulating, so the stimuli themselves, what might trigger that arousal for us, can vary across individuals, can also be conditioned, and we can associate different things based on our own experiences, based on our social and cultural exposure. We are, like lingerie is quite often in the United States associated as something that's sexually stimulating, right? Not something like ice cream. For me, like drumsticks are interesting because one of my very first partners loved to have a drumstick after sex. And so for me, I've kind of associated that drumstick with sexual pleasure and enjoyment. And so it elicits not necessarily an arousal response, but definitely a warm, comforting response now. And then also, as I mentioned, shame and stigma are very powerful. Too often, I have my students do journals, and they are exploring their own sense of sexuality, and too often they are actually carrying shame and stigma, either from larger society or maybe within their own family, and their own family's perception of sex has been imposed upon them, or maybe religious trauma and shame that's imposed upon them, and that can be internalized, and then it can directly impede one's ability to enjoy healthy, normal arousal. These responses were sewn into our biological design because they support reproduction. Sex is an important part of human survival. So an arousal response is perfectly normal and healthy. And I really want to give you permission to not shame your body for responding in the way that it was designed to respond. It's normal to feel pleasure when your clitoris is touched, or you touch your clitoris, or when your penis is touched, or when you touch your penis. That's perfectly normal. Those tissues were designed to have that sensory experience. That arousal response was designed to be activated with that kind of touch. You were designed to want to have sex. These are normal, natural, biological drives, urges, and responses. So I want to help offer you a sense of normalcy and liberation from any kind of shame or stigma that you might carry or have internalized throughout your life. And I want you to invite yourself to a much more empowered and sex positive perception of yourself and others. So let's talk about the brain. As I mentioned, touching the penis and touching the clitoris, guess what? It activates our brain in very distinct ways, right? That central nervous system is so powerful. And although our clitoris and our penis can be very pleasurable to touch, the brain is really the perception of that touch and it activating those pleasure centers in the brain. That's where pleasure is fully experienced. And so when you have all that other psychological static and that stigma and that shame and that internalization of the trauma, right, that can impede our brain's ability to enjoy that sensory response. And so when you think about healthy sexual contact, it can be very pleasurable. And if you have the opportunity and privilege and joy of experiencing orgasm, it can be very pleasure. Now, some have the ability to do it without any physical touch, where you can have such a powerful connection with your mind that you can experience that same pleasure of an orgasm and that same pleasure of sexual contact without the physical stimulation. Some might be able to orgasm when their erogenous zones are touched that aren't even related to the clitoris. And so it's really important to understand the power of the brain in experiencing not just sexual pleasure, but any kind of pleasure, right? So here's some specific areas of the brain that are directly involved in orgasm and sexual arousal, that are directly involved in processing that sensory stimulation, so that sensuality of touch in either your genitals or in other erogenous zones. And some of those zones can include the neck area, some of them can include the lower back, your inner thighs, your lips, your nipples. Some people are very aroused when you touch their feet, their hands. The hands can be very sensual. I'm a hands person. Some might even say I have a hand fetish. So hands are really important to me. Hips can be really important. So know your body. Know those areas of your body. Some people say like touching in these like crevice spots, like the areas that don't get a lot of stimulation, like within your elbow, the fold of your elbow, the fold of your arm, the fold behind your knee, and sometimes the crevices and creases where your thighs join your hips and your pelvic bone. Those can be very stimulating for some. Some people like a light touch. Some people like a little bit more pressure on the touch. Some people like a firm touch. Some people like to be scratched. Some people like a gentle scratch. Some people like more of a digging type scratch. Some people like slow and soft touch. Some people like more aggressive, rapid touch. So understanding how your body responds to those different types of touch is really important. understanding the areas of your body that respond to that type of touch is really important. And then understanding, your partner's erogenous zone. So being able to communicate this is so, so important. Communication is going to be your greatest tool for having a healthy sexual relationship with one or more partners. Your hot spot zones are, in fact, your sex organs, your breasts, and the anus. The anus can be very stimulating for both males and females. Now, move away from the homophobia, right? Move away from that. Forget about the stigma and social hierarchy associated and all that other baggage and nonsense associated with, putting pressure on men to be masculine and heterosexual and that's superior. No. Know your body, and that may include your anus, and that doesn't mean anything about your sexuality. Anal stimulation can appeal to people of varying sexualities, of varying gender identities, and that can include touching, that can include inserting something into the anus, that could include rimming, but it can include all different types of stimulation. Again, try to put all that stigma, that social hierarchy and ranking aside, and open yourself up to really knowing what arouses your body and what type of touch, and be willing to be open and communicative with your partner. And let me also say this. Also, that's important information to keep between you and your partner. Even if you break up down the road, I don't think it's healthy or even, an indication of integrity for you to be sharing your partner's sexual proclivities or interests with others and with future partners. Certainly it's okay to have a healthy dialogue about the types of activities that you have found to be enjoyable, or the experience that you've had or you're willing to have with a current or prospective partner, but to really divulge and share what a former partner or past partner likes or doesn't like, I think that kind of violates some important ethics. So I'm promoting healthy communication between you and your existing partner, but at the same time, I'm also encouraging you to establish some very healthy, explicit boundaries around what you're going to do with that information and under what circumstances you're allowed to share it or not share it. And if a future partner demands to know who you did this with or who you did that with, that's a red flag, right? Being able to say, I'm happy to talk about my experience, but I don't want to talk directly about any one partner out of respect for the privacy and trust that they shared with me and that we agreed to in the context of our relationship, just as I would want to honor and respect your privacy within our relationship. I want to honor that as well. And if they don't respect that, then that's a red flag. And so you can make a determination as to how you want to proceed in that relationship. So I just want to, give you that side note. Now, when the brain or when the body is touched in these erogenous zones, any area of your body for that matter, then that information is relayed. We have sensory receptors within our skin that pick up the process of pressure, pain, temperature, we feel tickles sometimes, and all of that is picked up, and then it goes through a process of what we call transduction, and it's translated into neural impulses that then get processed by your brain. And where they get processed by your brain is within that somatosensory cortex. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the different lobes of the brain, but we have the frontal lobe, which is the largest lobe, and it's in hemispheres, right? So it's kind of like an orange. You break it in half, and you put those two halves together, and that is the hemispheres of the brain. And you have a frontal lobe on the right side and a frontal lobe on the left side. Then behind the frontal lobe, right about here, is what we call a parietal lobe. And there's two strips, one that goes along the end of the frontal lobe that butts up to the parietal lobe, and then one that goes along the parietal lobe that butts up to the frontal lobe. And the part in the frontal lobe is your motor cortex, and that is the area of the brain that is associated with being able to control movement, direct, intentional, conscious movement. So move the right arm. That would be controlled in my left hemisphere and my left motor cortex. Move the left arm. That's going to be controlled in my right hemisphere and my right motor cortex. You have a corresponding cortex in the parietal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe is associated with intentional, conscious, deliberate thought, activity, your decision making, your problem solving, your impulse control. Your parietal lobe is largely involved in your sensation, your sensory experiences. So it's like it processes our hearing, our sight, our taste. Our smell is in our olfactory bulb that kind of goes right up under the frontal lobe. So it has a little bit more direct connection. But there's some sort of activation in our parietal lobe involved in sensory processing. And part of that is our somatosensory cortex, that cortex that runs along, bumps up against the frontal lobe, right next to the motor cortex. And this is not controlling bodily movements, but now receiving those neural impulses about the stimulation we're experiencing across different areas of our body. They've actually mapped out specifically where on that strip, a specific location on that strip corresponds to a specific area of the body. And so this is what we call a homunculus, and it is effectively a map. So in this part of the area is where your genitalia, any kind of touch of your genitalia or engagement of your genitalia is sensed here in this part of the homunculus. And your toes, your foot, your leg, your hips, notice that these might actually be erogenous zones for you as well. And then as you continue to go down your hip, your trunk, the abdominal area, your neck, your head, shoulders, arm, and so on and so forth. And so this homunculus is a map of both our motor and our sensory experiences. So there's a homunculus for your motor cortex, and there's a homunculus for your sensory motor cortex. And that's the area of the brain that picks up the sensations. And then we have the pleasure center that might start to produce some neurotransmitters and some hormones in response to those pleasures. Okay, so sensation is in fact the process of picking up that sensory data. And we have receptors throughout different areas on our tongue, in our nasal passages, in the hairs in our ears. Those are the sensory receptors for hearing that pick up the sound waves. We have the rods and cones inside our eyes. Those are the sensory receptors that pick up the light waves that come in from vision. So you have the physical stimulus and touch, motion, light, sound waves, temperature. Those things are the stimulus that come in, picked up by the receptors, and then the receptors go through a process of transduction where that information is picked up and translated into neural impulses that our brain can understand. That then is transmitted And the sensory motor cortex picks it up, and then it's analyzed through the parietal lobe and other areas of the brain as being pleasurable, arousing, or not. So these are kind of the steps of sensation and perception. Now, perception matters, right? Because now once it gets to our cerebral cortex, certain things like pain can actually activate a relay, just a reflex response, right? So it doesn't even need to connect to our cerebral cortex at all. But typically, pleasure is connected to our cerebral cortex, or non-reflex responses are connected to our cortex. So perception matters. So again, if you are carrying any kind of internalized stigma or trauma that you haven't processed yet, it can hinder your ability to fully perceive that sexual contact as pleasurable, right? It also means that you can train yourself to, and you can be conditioned and socialized to perceive certain things as pleasurable, such as pain, right? And so it can go both ways, and it's important for you to decide what you deem as being healthy and desirable for you. Some people think, they want to incorporate a little bit of hair pulling, or they want to incorporate spanking, or they want to incorporate some BDSM, and they have associated that and perceive that as pleasurable. That sensation is pleasurable and desirable for them, and that's perfectly acceptable. As long as they're engaging in very open, consensual exchanges with their partner or partners, then that's perfectly fine, right? And so you have to decide if, in fact, you want to open the opportunity, open yourself up to the possibility of enjoying different things as being pleasurable. And that's between you and first you, right? You make the decision for yourself, and then you and your partner can make decisions for one another, or for yourselves, but communicate that with one another. And also, you have the right to change your mind too, so keep that in mind as well. But this has a direct connection to arousal and to your sexual pleasure overall. Now, there is, in the event that you do have some trauma in your background, whether it's psychological or physical or sexual trauma and abuse, you can actually engage in therapy, and couples who are struggling can engage in sex therapy, and it likely will include some sort of sensate focus. When we look at sensate focus, we're looking at really focusing on tuning in to the sensations of your body, learning how to just be at peace with your body and enjoy those sensual experiences, and separating that from the psychological and physiological remnants of trauma that might still be present, that might be inhibiting your ability to fully enjoy the sensual and sexual connections with yourself or others. And so sensate focus is going to incorporate various sensory activities and homework into your therapy. They're going to encourage you with yourself or with your partner, maybe to engage in non-sexual touching that may or may not involve your genitals. It might be whole body touching. It might be allowing yourself to experience that sensual arousal and that even sexual arousal, but not actually engaging in intercourse. Teaching you how to pleasure each other in sensual ways that don't necessarily involve intercourse. There can be a lot of pressure associated with intercourse, and for someone that's trying to work through psychological or physical or sexual trauma, there can be a lot of barriers associated with intercourse. So learning how to have that sensory pleasurable experiences learning how to allow your body and give your body and mind permission to enjoy those things can be a wonderful start to kind of liberating yourself of that trauma and giving it power and control over your pleasure. And I know this is a really blurry and bad image, but there are lots of resources available for you to explore. And as you are coming up with your own arousal analogies or stories this week, consider that sensory experience and how that might factor into your analogies. But we definitely want to work through what's often a cognitive behavioral approach, where we can be mindful of how we're cognitively perceiving these things, and shift our perceptions of this type of behavioral or action or physical engagement in our lives. And we want to break any kind of unhealthy pathological associations that might hinder us from truly experiencing sexual pleasure with ourselves or our partners. So the whole goal is to really improve your sexual pleasure and get you to communicate and learn how to pleasure one another, right? So hormones and pheromones are a huge part of our arousal. We often can look at hormone production might be one of the, or hormone tests, blood tests might be one of the very first things that a doctor might do in the event that you're experiencing sexual dysfunction. Why? Because hormones are directly related to arousal, right? Those androgens, those progesterones, those testosterones are really critical. And, they are sending appropriate messages, and so they can either activate arousal or they can impede arousal. They also work with other neurotransmitters like dopamine and oxytocin and norepinephrine, which are also, as you may know, related to mood as well. And so those things can be released, leading as an arousal response, leading up to sex, after orgasm, and even after, you've had intercourse, and as part of that attraction and arousal response, you might actually have increased levels of dopamine. And again, as we noted in the last chapter, that can be related to mood, right? So these all kind of interact with one another in simple and complex ways. But definitely we want to be making sure that we have, healthy, normative hormone levels that can allow you to enjoy sex in a healthy, productive way for you. And as we mentioned, testosterone, and then finally the relationship with other emotions like happiness, anger, anxiety, sadness. All of these things impact these neurotransmitter levels within our bloodstream, which can directly impact our arousal. Then there's the pheromones, which are also biochemicals, but hormones work within the bloodstream. Pheromones are actually emitted through the skin, and they act outside of the body. And they, like some animals can pick up on pheromones more because they have greater sensory processing in their nasal passages than we do. But we are still, although we may not be consciously aware, we're still definitely processing pheromones from those around us. And as I mentioned, pheromone production increases when we're aroused. So that can all be part of that arousal and sexual experience. And then we talked about some of the research that shows how we tend to be attracted to pheromones that are different than our own MHC genes, and how that's related to attraction. So let's get into some of the actual theories about arousal. So Masters and Johnson did this sexual response cycle, and they actually were a couple. They started out actually, I think, having an affair, but that's beside the point. He was a gynecologist, and they were some of the most bold researchers in psychological history. They actually came at a really good time as we were approaching the 60s and we were in a more liberated culture, and some of their work may have contributed to that. But they studied the arousal response scientifically. They studied anatomy, physiology, and sexual behavior. They actually had people engaging in sexual activity with electrodes hooked up to them, with different machines monitoring their arousal response. So some of it was masturbation, and some of it was actual sexual interaction between couples. And they had the plasmography that was actually looking at blood flow changes, airflow to the organ. And they specifically were monitoring the breasts, that should say skin, different muscle structures, bladder, rectum, external sex organs, and the lungs. They looked at blood pressure, pulse. All of these are the physiological changes that happen with with arousal. And they actually studied over 10,000 orgasms across 700 people. Their sample ranged from age 18 to 89. So it was a very diverse sample. And what they found was in contrast to some of the other theories, including Freud, who suggested that there's a different type of orgasm. Women can have clitoral orgasms, which are considered neurotic, or they can have vaginal orgasms. Guess what? They found that an orgasm is an orgasm is an orgasm. There's not two different types of orgasms. Men and women go through these same 4 stages where the body goes through a period of excitement, and that's when that autonomic nervous system is arousing, it's activating. You're seeing these rates increase for your heart rate, your respiration rate, your blood flow. We call that vasocongestion. When the penis swells, the labia starts to swell, the vagina actually becomes more engorged, and it starts to prepare itself for intercourse. The nipples and the clitoris are all changing. Their sensory experience is changing, and you might have some involuntary contractions. Often with orgasm, you find these rhythmic contractions that are happening involuntarily. After we've reached this excitement period, we go into a plateau period where we maintain these intense levels, these intense physiological levels. You might have some pre-seminal fluid or pre-cum, as you might hear it referenced, released by the penis, which, by the way, tells you withdrawal method does not work because there's still semen in there, there's still sperm in there, and you can still get pregnant. So even before you ejaculate, you've already released some. So it's important to note that. And the outer vaginal walls tighten as well. And then during orgasm, there's this release and what's referenced as a climax. And you have this release of that tension that's been mounting, and you can have these rhythmic contractions. Both the vaginal walls will contract, and then you'll see the penis contract as well. And during that time, oxytocin is released and it flows through the bloodstream, can actually increase your sense of your perception of that pleasure, and it makes you more open to bonding and connection. And orgasm may or may not include ejaculation. Ejaculation is when you're going to see seminal fluid come out of the penis. There is a female ejaculation for some. You might hear it as squirting. That actually does contain predominantly urine, but it actually can be part of an orgasmic response for some as well. And then your body goes into what's called resolution. And that's just returning back to homeostasis, or bringing your body back into balance. So you'll start to see your heart rate slow down, your respiration rate slow down, your perspiration rate slow down. And then men quite often go through what's called a refractory period, and that's a period where they're not responsive to sexual or genital stimulation, and so they can't get another erection right away. It takes time. And the younger you are, the shorter that refractory period, and the more you can have sex, repeatedly in one encounter. The older you are, the longer that refractory period, and the more stimulation is needed in order to generate another erection. Women don't necessarily have a refractory period, so we can have multiple orgasms repeatedly, sometimes within that same sexual encounter, sometimes multiple sexual encounters within that same time frame. There's also Kaplan's triphasic model, and this was produced by Helen Singer Kaplan. She was, in fact, or is, I should say, a sex therapist, and she adjusted Masters and Johnson's theory a bit so she could include the psychological elements, right? That desire. If I'm not psychologically, engaged, then I may not be able to have a physical arousal response. So that psychological and that physiological element need to work together. So she broke hers down into the 3 stages, with desire, excitement, which would be consistent with the arousal with Masters and Johnson, and then the orgasm. Now, not everybody orgasms, though, so you can have this excitement period without orgasming, just so you know. Some sex therapists would really encourage you to really get to know your body, and it's likely you just haven't found the right stimulation to promote your orgasm. You might need a different position, you might need a different rhythm, a different flow. You might need a different ambiance because your psychological element, that desire element, needs to be engaged differently. So definitely being willing to talk to your partner and have that open dialogue and that safe environment would be valuable. And the problem with this particular theory is, some argue that women don't just automatically have a sexual desire, that it might be more tied to emotion and other elements. And so there are critics of her theory. There's critics of Masters and Johnson. There's critics of all the theories. So know just kind of the basic gist of them, but also how they differ. There's the strengths and the criticisms of their theory. So the Bassin nonlinear approach really looks at it as a circular approach, which might be a more valuable visualization tool, especially when you're talking about the ability to engage in an ongoing sexual relationship. But you can have spontaneous desire, but then there can also be other desires and motivations that might encourage you to think about sex. It's our anniversary, it's our wedding day, so these things might be motivations in and of themselves. And then we have that sexual stimuli, that trigger, right? And then we have context and what's happening psychologically and how we're perceiving that ambiance, that romance. It might matter to some more than others, right? And then together, collectively, that relationship between the mind and the body can activate arousal and help you enjoy that physiological arousal. And then that now gets you to be responsive and engaging, and you can enjoy that sexual connection and satisfaction with your partner, which then might also encourage you and motivate you to have additional sexual encounters. And so it's really important that we understand from this theory that connection between the mind and body and how both are involved in the ongoing sexual desire and relationship, and that, it's not always about the orgasm, right? It can end with satisfaction, not just orgasm. And it's said that a good percentage of women don't ever experience orgasm. And so satisfaction, it can be, that doesn't mean sex isn't pleasurable. It doesn't mean it's not enjoyable and satisfying. And that's why this theory kind of takes some pressure off, because it doesn't necessarily show that everything's leading up to a climax, everything's leading up to orgasm. No, it's this symbiotic exchange that engages both the mind and the body and allows both the mind and the body to experience pleasure with oneself or with partners. And then there's the dual control model that looks at kind of a gas pedal and a brake pedal. We have the excitation, which is the gas pedal. That's our autonomic nervous system. Also has a gas pedal. It has our sympathetic nervous system, which is the excitation. And then our parasympathetic is the inhibition. So most definitely this theory, this dual control model, definitely aligns well with how we conceive the autonomic nervous system. This may actually coincide more with what's happening in the arousal stages of all these theories, or the excitement stage and Kaplan's model, or the excitement stage in the Masters and Johnson model, right? This actually is focusing on both the physiological and the psychological excitation that's happening, right? Or the bringing it back into balance, the inhibition of these things. And there becomes this tipping point where you're getting excited, gas, but at some point your body has to slow down and inhibit and suspend and stop that sexual excitation. That might come from within. Oh, they said something that triggered me. That might come from a knock on the door. That might come from a baby crying in another room. That might come from a lot of different things, right? Now, it's important to note that biologically and genetically, we all have different thresholds for excitement and arousal. Some people are comfortable driving on the freeway at 65, and that I'm like, we got to drive faster. I don't start to get nervous and stressed until I'm probably closer to, 100. But driving like 110, 120 definitely is beyond my comfort level. I know I've dated people that can drive, way faster than that, and it doesn't even faze them. So I'm mindful that we have different biological thresholds, right? Same is true for your sexual arousal. And so some people have a different capacity than others biologically and genetically, and that's okay. Having conversations and talking about your individual arousal levels and the compatibility of those arousal levels and what you can do within the context of a relationship can be very, very, very healthy. Talk about ways that you can excite each other. Talk about what might be overstimulation for you and too much excitement for you too, because for some, too much excitement might actually translate into discomfort, maybe even pain. And so having those conversations is really important as well. Again, it's important to note that our own individual identities and lived experiences can impact these things. The social identities that we maintain can impact our perceptions of ourselves and others, and then also just our cultural values that we impress upon these things, and I would say impose upon our sexual behaviors and relationships can also be a factor. So the best thing to do is be communicative, allow yourselves to be liberated from those outside pressures, give yourself grace and permission to be human, to explore your own body, to know yourself, and to share it in an empowered, confident way with your partner. So as we're seeing, sexuality and love can sometimes go hand in hand, right? We talked about oxytocin being released when we breastfeed, and that makes us bond and love our babies. And it can also be released during orgasm. So there is definitely a biochemical process involved in love, particularly in the early stages of love, right? We can be distinctly impacted when we're quote unquote in love, right? It can increase our mood. It actually can even increase our health and our functioning. In fact, my mom has always said my Aunt Loki died of a broken heart. She was with one man her whole life. She'd only had one sexual partner her whole life. He had cheated on her, and she was right about 50, and she was devastated. They separated. They were talking about divorce. She actually had a heart attack, and she passed away. And my mom forever says she died of a broken heart, because literally the biochemistry involved in love impacts our health, our heart function. Notice in all these arousal conversations, we're talking about an elevated heart rate. So our heart is impacted by the neurotransmitters involved in arousal and sexual arousal and involved in love. We are social creatures. We are designed for social connection. We are meant, and our survival response actually builds in during periods of stress a propensity to seek out others. And so relationships are a critical part of our health and functioning. Ideally healthy relationships where you can flourish, right? Where both parties can thrive. Know that it's dynamic, it's bidirectional, it's psychological, it's physical, right? Know that love produces biochemicals, and then those biochemicals actually help contribute to a sensation of love. So it's all very dynamic and interactive. It involves both our experience, both externally as well as our psychological experience. That cognitive perception matters, how we're perceiving those physiological responses. Are we perceiving it as thrilling or scary, right? And we can work with a therapist or a sex therapist specifically if we need to work through some of those past traumas or some of those imposed burdens that have been placed upon us and internalized, to help find a space where we can enjoy our bodies and the connections that we have with others. So if you find that any of these areas are disrupted in your relationships, then I'm going to encourage you to seek outside help and resources so that you can all experience a healthy love for yourself and a healthy love for others. So what is love? It's not just these biochemical mechanisms. It's not just how we receive these messages and the feedback loop and the communication that's happening, right? It also involves our vagus nerves, right? And these vagal sensations that are experienced. It's the emotions, those emotional constructs, the joy, the trust, the vulnerability. And it is a very vulnerable feeling. Arousal is vulnerable. That emotional connection is vulnerable. We're putting ourselves out there for rejection. And so it can be scary. And sometimes that fear can impede us. And we have to be willing to embrace the possibility. So I say vulnerability breeds intimacy. I want to put myself out there and be authentic and vulnerable, even if it means it's not going to be reciprocated. Because if I keep it in, guess what? It's not going to be reciprocated either. you have to express it wholly and completely in order to be able to embrace it, enjoy it, and exchange it. And so your brain sometimes can be a barrier for you. Your perception, your mind, your psyche, those emotional barriers can impede you from wholly enjoying it, from sharing it. They can also cause you to interpret it in negative ways or unhealthy ways. And it might, encourage you to kind of put some walls up. But I'm going to encourage you to take those walls down. I'm going to encourage you to see a therapist if you have things that continue to impede your ability to have healthy, functional, supportive relationships with others, whether that's sexual or otherwise. Make sure you're working through those psychological barriers that can be overcome. Also know that stress and love, again, we release these hormones that cause us to be more receptive and to seek out others during times of stress. Why? Because support systems and just access to support is a primary predictor of whether you can overcome barriers and challenges in life. And so we can have trauma bonding. I am a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault. And guess what? I have some deep bonds that still exist with my ex-husband. And I still love him in many ways. My daughters are sickened by it because they're like, Mom, you sound like a battered wife. I am. And those, I'm mindful that those neurochemical processes contributed to it. I'm thankful that I was able to keep distance from him for a good chunk of my adult life so I wasn't continuously sucked back in. And so I think having a background helps me understand physiologically, biochemically what's happening, and psychologically what's happening. And so also, outside of that trauma, think about how when you and your couple go through stressful things together and you overcome, you can be more bonded, right? Look at everything that we've accomplished and overcome together. It can connect you in powerful ways versus couples that have never endured trials and challenges together. And so you have to recognize that as well. Also, stress can sometimes bring out negative responses in people. They can become mean, bitter, aggressive, attacking of you as a loving, supportive partner. And maybe, they're not there to support you. They're not there to protect you. Or maybe you do bond and you do become a source of support and protection for one another. So there's definitely some survival value in releasing these hormones in periods of stress, but we have to be mindful of how they can impact us in negative pathological ways as well. And then also epigenetics. So we talk about how genetics shape our experiences and our development, but we don't often talk about how our experiences and our environment might shape our genetics. But we have research, and epigenetics is the field of study that looks at how environment, how experience may shape and change our genetics. It can actually influence and determine when genes are activated and when they are deactivated. So it can fundamentally, experience in our environment can change genetic expression. It can change how we biologically respond. And we do find, particularly when we look at adverse childhood experiences, when we look at trauma, those 100% can modify and alter our genetic expression. And then that can get passed on to other generations. And this is where generational trauma not only is psychological, but it's also genetic and biological as well. And this may account for, why certain racial groups have shorter life expectancy, right? And so we need to be mindful of this. Here's a couple of examples that are listed below, but talking about, high stress environments and the parental relationship and how that releases the vasopressin. In the like as a nursing mom, I nursed and I was in a very toxic relationship. And so that might have been passed on to my children. And now my children, actually both of my children produced from my very traumatic relationship, have major anxiety. And I can't help but think that them being exposed to that toxic environment, and me being in that toxic environment, and how that modified my hormone responses that then passed on to them. And then also your oxytocin exposure early in life may modify your hormonal systems and your productions of different hormones, which then influences your capacity for bonding, connecting, and arousal. So these are all things to think about. We are biochemical creatures, and exposing ourselves and our children to healthy environments is really good for us. It's good for our genetic health and well-being, and it's good for future generations. So try to find the barriers that impede you from building and maintaining healthy relationships and healthy environments. And then in terms of social behavior, again, we're social creatures, right? If we're isolated and we're loners and we're not socially connecting with others, that may change our neural pathways and how we're processing or producing oxytocin and vasopressin. And that can later impede our abilities for bonding, connection with others, and arousal, sexual or otherwise. And so it's really important that we maintain that healthy socialization from infancy on. And we're in a day and age where we sit behind a computer screen. We're even teaching now online. And we may not get that physical connection with others, but we need it. So if you do find yourselves in a virtual job or doing your classes virtually, do try to build in other in-person social activities in your life, whether it's a hobby, whether it's joining dance or joining classes that might let you learn how to play an instrument, or whatever it might be, right? Going to book clubs, but do try to build in activities in your life where you have that social interaction and connection with others. That social engagement is fundamentally important for the development of healthy neural processing of these hormones, healthy production of these hormones, which then ultimately help us cope with stress in healthy ways, help us have a better understanding of ourselves, and help us build healthy adaptive relationships moving forward. And much of it centers around oxytocin. And oxytocin not only impacts our sociability and our sexual relationships, it also in some ways can be used as medicine. Specifically, the heart actually uses it, responds well to it. It can be a protective factor and a healing factor for the heart. So after having negative heart experiences, or like a myocardial infarction, which is just a fancy word for heart attack, right? Your heart needs to heal, and oxytocin can be a healing and protective and restorative factor for that heart, so that it also can help with neural pathways and neurogenesis and the production of those neural connections, and it can promote tissue repair, and it can also help to reduce inflammation in the body, which also hinders our health and functioning. So oxytocin can be a really powerful medicine within the body as well. And again, that early life exposure not only impacts our ability to love, but it also impacts our health and well-being. People who are exposed to adverse childhood experiences and traumatic childhood and family relationships and toxic environments, they actually have more health problems and a shorter life expectancy. And so it's really important that we understand how that environment then impacts our production of these neurotransmitters and these hormones, and how that can impede our stress response, whether it's our autonomic nervous system, our HPA axis, which is our hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal gland axis, which is part of our endocrine system, which is associated more with long-term chronic stressors. So the autonomic nervous system kicks in with short-term stressors, and the endocrine system is activated when that stress is chronic and long-term, and that toxicity impacts our ability to produce and process oxytocin in healthy, functional, adaptive ways, and has far-reaching implications on our health and well-being. So the moral of the story is, be aware of your environment, be aware of your psychological functioning and barriers, be aware of your traumas, and be aware of your body, and tune in consciously to how your body reacts to certain stimuli, to certain people, and tune in to understanding and learning how your body can be aroused in a pleasurable, desirable way, and be willing to seek help and communicate with your partners so that you can fully enjoy a healthy sexual relationship and just health and well-being overall. With that, I'm going to have you wrap up with your reading. Make sure you do your reading and lecture notes after you've watched the video and done your chapter reading, and then make sure you're doing your learning activity. Have fun with it this week, and I wish you all much love and an abundance of healthy biochemical neurotransmitter releases in your life. I wish you many orgasms and much pleasure. I wish you psychological health to be able to enjoy that pleasure, and I wish you liberation and freedom and empowerment, free from the burdens of social stigma and self-shaming. So I wish you much love and aloha.